All right, so we were speaking about, so let Adam in here. So, okay, just to recap. So, okay, middle of page 242. So just to recap, we were speaking about these two big ideas, and then we'll continue. One idea is that our soul can really express itself and actualize itself by giving it wings. The wings of the soul, if you recall, are on the one hand, fear, on the other hand, love. We said that fear is more self-centeredness, or God-centeredness, not self-centeredness, God-centeredness, and being able to really ask the question of what does God want of me now at this point, rather than what I want of myself. Love, I think, is more easily definable. Love is this strong desire to connect with the source of God, with God himself, selflessly, of course, and unconditionally. But that's what that wing represents. Those are the two wings that we spoke about last class. We also spoke about how the Tanya functions in three realms and emphasizes these three realms so that we can function in them. And those realms are the thought, the speech, and the action. Those are the three realms the human being finds himself in. And the more we can work on our thoughts and on our speech and our actions, the more we can be living a life that's aligned with our deeper self and with God himself. And this is really what this is speaking about here at the bottom of page 242. So let's continue speaking of these three realms. Let's continue to read here, as you mentioned, Margot, even if it is not possible. Does anyone want to read? Anyone?
Nobody else? Okay, I'll read.
Go for it, Margot. Thank you.
Okay. Even if it is not possible for a person's thoughts and speech to be restricted to Torah alone, they can nevertheless be filled with it, namely that Torah constitutes his true and only desire, a desire that suffuses the innermost part of his heart. If a thought or word is not Torah, then he thinks it or says it only because he must, only because they are essential to his existence, an existence dedicated to Torah, following which he immediately returns to his true and only interest, the Torah. When such is the case, his faculties of thought and speech are indeed filled with Torah.
Right. And then he'll get to actions, right? But these two realms, I have to mention, are probably two of the three. These three realms are the most dominant and, in fact, the most defining of a person. The Baal Shem Tov famously says about the realm of thought that if you want to know where you are, look where your thoughts are. You would say in Hebrew, "Bimkom shel machshavato shel adam shamu nimtza." If you think of food all day, that's who you are. If you think of soccer all day, that's who you are. Where your thoughts are, that's who you truly are. That's how dominant and how important and how defining the world of thoughts is. But then you have the world of speech too, that is quite defining. That evokes a different line from the Haggadah, by the way, coming up. On Passover, we read about the four sons, and they are introduced to us by Chacham Mahu Omer, the wise son, what does he say? Rasha, the wicked son, what does he say? Tam Mahu Omer, right, the innocent son, what he says, and the one that doesn't know how to ask, what does he say? And the Hasidic commentaries really point out that the question should be read differently. The wise man, what does he say? The wise man, Mahu, what is he? Omer, look at what he says, and then you'll know what he is. Rasha, Mahu, what is he? Omer, look at what he says, and you'll know what it is. Because also, if you want to know who a person is, look at what he speaks about. Look at his speech. If his speech is filled with content and wisdom, then you know he's a wise son. If not, he's a wicked son, or it's an innocent son, and so on and so forth. That's how they interpret that part of the Haggadah. So we see that these both worlds are perhaps the worlds that are most defining of a person. And therefore, if one wishes really to work on himself, refine himself, and become in a way more connected to God, then it starts with those two worlds. If our thoughts are filled with all sorts of, as they call it in Yiddish, of narishkeit, of nonsense, then maybe it's time to fill our thoughts with some more Torah, as the Tanya suggests here, as Rabbi Stanzel suggests here. And if our speech is filled with gossip and other terrible things, maybe it's time to fill our speech with more contentful things and with Torah too. Because the more we will fill our thoughts and our speech with God, the more we will be defined as divine beings.
Rabbi,
beings. Yes,
it is said you are what you do.
Okay, good. Now we'll get
and if I could just add to that, when all is said and done, more is said than done. More is said than is done.
Right, by most people. Right. They know how to talk the talk, but to walk the walk is a different story. More is said than done. Right. But we'll get to the world of actions now. That's right. But speaking of those two worlds, we can see how defining they are, how crucial they are in the person's connection with Hashem. I will also say this, that many will tell you, speaking of thoughts, that, well, I can't control my thoughts. You know, I'm distracted. It's true. We live in an age of distraction where we're distracted all the time. But the Tanya makes it very, and I think science will agree with this too, but makes it very clear that you might not be able to control your thoughts. You're right. But you have the power to let them in or to kick them out. That's what you have the control. Once they've permeated your mind, then they go wild. But you can decide not to engage with them. Just take them out of your mind. Or you can decide also, if you're stronger, not to let them in the first place. So the thought itself, you might not have control of, but you have the control of its entrance and of its exit. That's what one should work with. If the thoughts, of course, are negative, the thoughts are positive, then they should fill your mind. That's what makes you divine, as mentioned. Now, speech, we have more control of. We have more control of really not just what enters and what comes out, but also of the content itself, of every word. And action even more so, as we're about to see too. But that's just an important point to point out. Okay, so those are the two worlds. Let's go to the world of, of course, if there's any comments, disagreements, please feel free to speak your minds. So let's go to the world of action also, which completes the picture. Bottom of 242, and that the faculty of action. Anyone? Or Margot, you can continue otherwise.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that the faculty of action is in his hands, as also in the rest of the 248 limbs, should function exclusively in the action of the mitzvot, which is the third garment of the godly soul.
Right.
As elaborated in chapter 4, the soul has three garments by which it expresses itself outwardly: thought, speech, and action. The desire of the godly soul is that these should be exclusively in its domain, that the person's thoughts, words, and deeds should serve only the godly soul, making the body the exclusive instrument of its will.
Right. And I would say that that's really the definition of a righteous person. A person whose thoughts, speech, and actions are always filled with divinity, with what God wants of him or her. Now, can we achieve that state? Maybe not 100% of the time, but we can try and achieve it 80% of the time, 75% of the time. The more we use those three realms for God, then the more we become righteous and aligned with God, as we were speaking about a few classes ago. I will also say that these worlds are neutral worlds, right? They're like the vehicle that we use, the car that we use, to use that example. We decide what is filled with it and what is filled with it. The more we fill that car with divinity, the more it travels towards divinity, is connected to divinity. The animal soul, as we're about to see, wants the exact opposite. And I just want to go a little bit deeper, and then you can go forward. And again, I'd love to hear your comments and disagreements and questions and so on. But just to speak about the Hebrew words also that are used to speak, to name those three worlds. So the world of thoughts is called machshava. The world of speech is called dibur, olama dibur, and the world of action is called olama maaseh. What's interesting is this, because as we all know, the Hebrew language has many words that have dual or triple meanings. So the word machshava, if you think about this, yes, comes from the word thinking, but also comes from the word moach sheba. as the Kabbalists point out. Moach means the mind that's in it. And what this really means is that the world of thought has the ability to take the mind. Which mind are we speaking about? The mind of God. Moach, the mind of God, and bring it into our mind. So when we think Torah, what's Torah? Torah is God's thought, God's mind. So when we think the words of Torah, we are merging our mind with God's mind. That's what the ultimate world of thought looks like. Moach, the mind of God, Sheba comes in it, in our heads. And that's the merge of the two minds, the human mind and the divine mind, and makes our mind godly. That's the world of thought, and that's why it's named again Machshava. The word Dibur we've spoken about many times, but the world of speech is has an interesting name, because Dibur is the same word, I know we've mentioned this, as the word for bees, right? And that's because the world of speech is exactly like bees. It can produce honey or it can sting. The power is in our mouths. We can decide. Now, what's interesting is that the default setting of the bee is to produce honey, right? Not to sting. And that's because that should be our default setting. In fact, if the bee stings, it dies. So too, if we sting, if we use our words to sting, we die a little bit, die spiritually. And then there's the word of action that we just spoke about. Olama Maaseh, as it's called. What's interesting is Maaseh does not just mean action, but Maaseh also comes from the word to, as Kabbalists point out, Me'aseh, which means to knead, like kneading dough, right? Not N-E-E-D, but K-N-E-A-D, right? That's how it's spelled in English. To knead dough. Why? What's the connection? Because eventually what really molds our lives, as William was pointing out, was the action, is the action. The more we focus on divine action, then the molding of our lives will be a divine molding. Just like that kneading of the dough. The way we knead the dough is what will mold that dough and mold that challah that we're making for Shabbos. So that's what Maaseh really means. So it's interesting just to note these 3 points, because it can also enhance our relationship with thought, our relationship with speech, and our relationship with action, which are 3 of the most defining factors in the human life, and therefore need the most work, as the Tanya points out here. Anyhow, those are the three big ideas. But again, love to hear your comments. Otherwise, we can continue. But please, I shouldn't be just monologuing. Okay, anyone? All right, fine. So let's continue. Let's continue, Margot.
Okay. But the desire of the animal soul, which is derived from klipa, is the very opposite. The author does not elaborate in the specific ways that the animal soul endeavors that the body's faculties and garments should serve it alone, as he does in the case of the godly soul. Perhaps because we are already all too familiar with these details, and in any case, there is no duty to teach them. The idea that the animal soul desires the exact opposite of the godly soul implies that there is no room here for compromise. A person might arrive at some sort of compromise between the 2 halves of his inner self in an attempt to effect a peaceful coexistence between them. But such compromise is inherently partial and temporary. Ultimately, both souls want one thing: complete domination. So inherently, there's no room for compromise.
Right. So if we use that word of vehicle to describe that's what these worlds are all about, it's the vehicle that we use to connect to Hashem or to disconnect from Hashem. And of course, there's a major fight between the animal soul and the godly soul on who will control that vehicle. And in that fight, there's really no compromise, no peace. There's only dominance. And we have to decide. And by the way, it's true in many spheres of life. I mean, to really dilute this a little bit so that we can connect. But I can't say, for example, I want to go on a diet, but I love cheesecake. It doesn't work. You can't say, I'm going to make peace with cheesecake, so I'm going to have just a little bit. No, you're either on a diet, you're having cheesecake. It's true for many other spheres of this world. And it's certainly true here for the battle between the animal soul and the godly soul. I know peace is a very high value, but in some areas of life, there is no room for peace. You either allow the divine soul to dominate you, or you allow the animal soul, God forbid, to dominate you. Here, there's no compromise, no room for compromise, as Rabbi Stein says. But let's continue a little bit more because he develops this point. Let's go, Margot.
We emphasize this because a compromise of this sort is one thing that Judaism cannot accept. This is one of the reasons why it is difficult to be a Jew. If all that were required of a Jew would merely be to go to synagogue and pray there at certain times, it would be far simpler. But the Jew is also required to leave the synagogue for the outside world. And the real question is, what happens then? It is impossible to make some sort of compromise, cutting life in two, half for holiness and half not, because the spheres of holiness and klipa cannot live alongside each other peacefully. Inevitably, a struggle ensues in which one soul prevails.
Right, and it's an important point of life. And by the way, we've had that in Jewish history in the times of the Maskilim movement, in the late 1700s, led mainly by Moses Mendelssohn, if you're familiar with that historic era, shortly after the emancipation of Europe by Napoleon. So Jews were left with a choice. How do we, the world now has opened its gates to the Jew. How should the Jew deal with the world? One school of thought was, we'll be Jewish on the inside, but be non-Jews on the outside. So when we go, as Rabbi Steinsaltz is pointing out here, when we go to the streets of the world, then we'll go back to our non-Jewish status. But inside, we'll be Jewish. That was really the big idea, to summarize it in just one thought. But as we see now from history, it's just not a sustainable idea. It dissipated. Why? Either because again, when we are speaking about the battle between the animal soul and the godly soul, there's no room for compromise. Whoever is dominant, that's who will be sustained. If it's the godly soul that's dominant, then it's the godly soul that will prevail over history. If it's the animal soul that's dominant, then God forbid, that's what will prevail. There's no room for peace in that realm. Now, I will add to that, and I will say this, that I know that this is very harsh, and it sounds quite harsh for everyone, but you may ask yourself, well, then, if that's the case, I'm being a hypocrite, because I know that my life sometimes is not completely controlled by the divine soul. And I'm living a life of compromise, whether a conscious compromise or not. Because at the end of the day, they both have room. Both the animal soul and the godly soul have room in this vehicle that we're speaking about. So I would go, and I wouldn't, chas v'shalom, God forbid, beat myself down. I would say and ask myself, well, what is my intent? My intent is indeed to have the godly soul always control my vehicle. Sometimes I falter, and that's normal. That's part of the human condition. But as long as that's the intent, and that's the goal of that intent, then in essence, it's the divine soul that's in control. Yes, the animal soul has its way from time to time. I think we have to go back also to the intent. What are we intending to do? What is our goal? Is our intent really to make a compromise? No. It's just that the animal soul sometimes gets the better of us, and that's fine. And we're still working on it, and it's a lifetime project. Because that's the way it is with the Beinoni, as the Tanya here defines. We're not righteous. But the intent has to be that, and the goal and the efforts have to be all channeled towards this idea that the animal soul cannot have any type of control in this vehicle, and rather it's the divine soul that's in charge. So really it's an important point, because reading these words, it could be very demoralizing. But
you brought up Napoleon.
Yes.
And the writer of the Tanya, the first Lubavitcher Rebbe,
yes,
his position was that he preferred to be under the domination of the Tsar than under the liberation of Napoleon, and he encouraged the Jews to actually fight for the Tsar.
That's right.
Because he feared assimilation more than he feared the hand of the oppression. of the Tsar.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. There was a big argument between the great rabbis of the time. The author of the Tanya took that stance, you're right, along with some other rabbis, and some rabbis disagreed with him. It's a question that I think was more theoretical than practical, because at the end of the day, history was defined by those empires. The Napoleon versus the Tsar. But it's an interesting point. It's an interesting point. You're right. Historically, there are many aspects, especially in that era, that raise our eyebrows and ask many questions. But I will say this, that I think that it shows whether you would agree with the author of the Tanya or not. But it shows how important it was, how he walked the walk and didn't just talk the talk. He's speaking about how the divine soul should be always in control, and how when you're in the streets of the world, you also have to be controlled by the divine soul. So he cared for that. He really, at least his stance, as you pointed out, William, indicates just that he really cared for the divine soul and for its full control at all times. Now, one can agree, one can disagree with the actual stance, but still. But again, it's important not to beat ourselves down. What's important is to remember that should be the intent. When we wake up in the morning, we should say, well, okay, I'm going to have my divine soul in control. Sometimes during the day, it won't be. But as long as that's the goal, and we set that goal and we strive for it, then we're achieving what the Tanya here is speaking about. Okay, let's continue again, unless there's other comments, so on. A further problem. Speak about one more problem here.
A further problem is that the spheres are not clearly defined. For within the range of the animal soul's desires are also aesthetic, philosophical, and even religious cravings. The aim of the animal soul is to satisfy the ego. And if doing holy things makes a person feel good, the animal soul can also grant him this illusion of holiness. As long as a person wishes to serve God part-time as a hobby, his animal soul will be fully supportive of the endeavor. It will provide him with all the accoutrements of holiness and holy feelings, as much as he desires for the essence of the battle. The quintessential point over which the souls are fighting is who should occupy the innermost point, the epicenter of the person. Rabbi Isaac Meir of Gur used to say that once Satan has taken from a person the point of truth, he is prepared to leave him all the nonsense. If the person wants to wear a stremel, the Hasidic fur hat, he can wear it. If he wants to pray, let him pray. If he wants to be a chassid, let him be a chassid, because even so, he can remain just an animal. Perhaps he is a different animal, somewhat more refined, who enjoys different pastimes, such as attending concerts, perhaps even concerts exclusively devoted to chazanut, Jewish liturgical music, but an animal nonetheless.
Right, I can hear Rabbi Steinsaltz say these words, because he was a seeker of truth. And Rabbi Steinsaltz would use this example very often in very harsh words. But what Rabbi Yitzchak Meir of Gur, who also known as the Chidushei Harim, would say is so true, that the evil inclination, the animal soul really wants to capture, to kidnap the person's essence, the person's heart. Once he's kidnapped that essence, he'll leave you your shtreimel, he'll leave you your payas, he'll leave you your prayers 3 times a day, he'll leave you everything, because he's got your essence. It's a very harsh, very, very harsh thought. But what this says is that we have to remember that the animal soul is quite clever in trying to dominate this vehicle, because it will also use some seemingly holy tools while to distract us from what the godly soul really wants. So to give you a biblical example, Joseph was thrown into a pit by his brothers. You remember that biblical scene? Was thrown into a pit by his brothers. Reuven, as the firstborn, said to himself, you know what? I can't fight my brothers. They just too enraged right now. But I'm going to wait till they go, and then I'll go and take Joseph out of the pit and save him, because I feel this responsibility towards him as the firstborn. So what did he do in the meantime? He let his brothers sit there by the pit. He went and he prayed, and even fasted, and he did teshuvah for previous sins. That's what Rashi says. After he prayed and so on, he comes back, and to his astonishment, the brothers are not there, and Joseph is not even in the pit, and his plant went down the drain. What had happened to Joseph? He was sold to slave masters, as we know. Now, the Lubavitcher Rebbe so powerfully points out, you see that there's a time for prayer, and there's a time when one should not pray, but rather act. Reuven thought he was being holy. Oh, I'm going to pray. I'm going to do teshuvah. I'm going to fast. But in the meantime, your brother is being thrown in a pit. Why aren't you acting? Because you're afraid. So yeah, the animal soul comes to you and says, no, yeah, you're right. Your fear is legitimate. Go and pray in the meantime. Go and do teshuvah in the meantime. And it takes you away from acting, from saving your fellow brother, from saving a fellow Jew. So there's a time in which even prayer, which seems to be such a holy act, should not be exercised, because that idea to pray comes from the animal soul to prevent you from acting. So here we see again from a very biblical scene how the animal soul can use holy tools to distract you from your real purpose, from the purpose of the godly soul. And it happens throughout our lives. People close themselves in yeshivas all day long to study Torah. God bless them. I'm not judging them. But very often it's just because the animal soul says, well, go study Torah, you'll feel good. By the way, yes, there's Jews being lost to the sea of assimilation, but who cares? I'm going to close myself in my own little room and study Torah. I ask you, does that come from the animal soul? Does that come from the godly soul? And it's true in many other realms. It's true in the realms of our own lives too. Sometimes we say, oh, I feel good. Let me go on a spiritual high. But 1 second, maybe your wife needs you at home. Maybe your children need you to do homework with them. Maybe now's not the time for you to say Tehillim. You have to ask yourself. I think one of the great indications is whether my animal soul is leading me towards some spiritual feeling, while my godly soul really is leading me towards veritable action. Usually the action comes from the godly soul, and those good spiritual feelings come from the animal soul when they are put one against each other. That's how we can know how to, that what to follow. If it's an action-based mitzvah, then it's most probably from the godly soul. If it's just a spiritual feeling or just an intangible act like prayer that comes in lieu of that action, then it probably comes from the animal soul. But that's how these words can be understood by Rabbi Yitzchak Meir. And it's true also very often that what he is also relating to is sometimes the animal soul wants our essence. We're about to celebrate Purim, and please come to CBT tomorrow night for the Grand Megillah reading, 6:30 p.m. But with your costumes, by the way, and then the next day also for the other Megillah readings, we have multiple ones. But it's interesting because Haman looked at the Jewish people, and his first exclamation was Yeshno Am Echad Mefuzar Umefurad Ben Am Mefuzar Umefurad Ben Amim, that there is a nation that is scattered among the other nations. Now, the word for there is Yeshno should have been Yesh Am Echad. What does it mean Yeshno? And the Midrash points out that Haman was referring to the fact that Yeshno in Hebrew does not just mean there is, but it means they are sleeping, Yashen. When he looked at the Jewish nation, he said, they're sleeping. What does it mean that they're sleeping? Many of them were praying 3 times a day. Many of them have strimals, maybe, payas, but they had no life in their mitzvahs. They had no passion. They're sleeping. And when Haman saw that, he said, now they're vulnerable. Now I can exterminate them. Because when a nation is sleeping, when a nation has its heart captivated, kidnapped by the animal soul, then it's much weaker. And that's what Rabbi Yitzchak Meir is speaking about. That's another aspect of his words, that every mitzvah that we do has to come with true life, with true passion, with true devotion. And then we can ensure that the animal soul also is kept out of the picture, that the divine soul who wants that heart, who wants that passion, is the one really in control. But these are very strong words that ought to be internalized to ensure the victory of the divine soul day in and day out.